Storytelling is like a game of charades, and the rules are decently simple. You're allowed to use words, but you can't explicitly say the phrase you're trying to get across. You have to weave it in as subtle as you can in the context, in your character's actions, and in their tone of voice. You have different tools for different mediums, like with a TV show, you have sound, you have visuals, whereas with a book, you just have words. But whatever it is, you cannot ever state what you want the audience to know. You have to use what you have to make them come up with it themselves. It's like Inception. You have to plant the idea as deep as you can, because if they don't believe it is their own idea, they will reject it. In the storytelling world, we call this rule show, don't tell, and everybody talks about how important it is, but it can be a lot harder to get right than you think, and it's definitely not something that just comes easy to most writers. I myself have had trouble with it in the past, so our question for today is, how do you use this rule effectively? How do you show, don't tell? And with the recent season 4 of Stranger Things out, I thought I would try to learn a few things from them. I found 2 character arcs from this season, one that is super effective at show, don't tell, as well as one that is not so effective, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to take a look at how these 2 character arcs handle their tools of the medium differently, and what emotional reaction that elicited by the end. So let me introduce myself. My name is Lindsay, and I'm a little new around here if you couldn't tell. If you want more analyses on your favorite shows, books, and movies, then smash subscribe and leave me a like so I know. If you disagree with me at any point during the video, feel free to leave a comment. I crave pain. No, but seriously, I love to talk about these things with like-minded people. It's one of my favorite things to do. I'll probably keep making analysis videos like this, whether people watch it or not, but it still lets me know and it helps me out a bunch, so thanks so much. And without further ado, let's get right into this analysis. So with both Eddie and Max, we have clear character arcs going on. With Max, she starts off grieving from the loss of her brother. She doesn't want to open up to anyone or let them help her. And by the end, she's letting the others take care of her. She's opening up to Lucas, and she's letting her guard down around her friends. And the same thing for Eddie. In the beginning, he's a bit of a coward, and by the end, he learns to stand and fight. Of course, he dies hero of Hawkins, deciding to run straight into danger with the bats in the Upside Down to buy the others a little more time to fight Vecna. So one of these arcs was really good at show, don't tell, and the other one I thought was not so great. So let's talk about why that is. I have 4 categories that I think are the most important to focus on here, and these categories are going to be the 4 C's, okay? Consequences, consistency, connotation, and change. That's right, we have fun here. It's a sad truth of the world that kids tend to learn much more effectively when they experience a clear, natural consequence for their actions than if their parents just tell them not to do something. Your parents can tell you all they want about how bad it hurts to get burned, but chances are you are not going to be properly motivated to stay away from that stove until you felt the agony of a burn for yourself. Negative consequences have a powerful effect on our minds and our behavior, and they're a powerful way to show that a character needs to learn something. Bad consequences can also create a sense of urgency and increase the tension and the stakes in any given situation. So just a small example, Max has this little scene in the beginning of the season where she's talking to her school counselor, Ms. Kelly, about her trauma from the last season and how she's dealing with that. She remembers all these nightmares that she's had and the headaches, and she lies to the therapist saying she's been feeling better. And Ms. Kelly senses that she's lying and says that if Max doesn't tell her what's bothering her, she just simply won't be able to help her. So now we've established Max's flaw, that she can't open up about her problems. And we've also been introduced to a consequence to her flaw. No one can help her, she's alone. And that gives a little bit of urgency to her problem. We notice that she needs to learn to open up to the people around her because there's negative consequences if she doesn't. And we get all that in this short, simple scene of dialogue between Max and her school counselor. Imagine if we hadn't had this scene, and if instead Max had just told Lucas later that she was having trouble opening up to people. That would not have been as convincing or felt nearly as urgent, because we wouldn't have had that consequence. We wouldn't have something to cling on to, some reason that Max needs to change. So what other consequences do we have in Max's arc? Well, the big one comes a little later when they realize that Vecna is targeting Max. When she realizes she may only have a few hours to live, what does Max do? She writes this stack of letters, one to each of her friends and family, telling them they can't open them until she's dead, because she doesn't want to open up and talk about these things while she's alive. So the consequence here, now that she knows she could be dying, becomes a bit more serious. If Max can't learn to open up, she could die without ever telling her friends and family how she feels about them, at least not in person. And Lucas calls her out on this and even adds stakes to this by pleading with her to talk to him. There's consequences not only for Max, but for him as well. If she doesn't learn to open up, then Lucas loses a friend and a possible chance for growing their relationship while she's alive. So that's a great progression of stakes, and it comes with a great sense of urgency. We really feel like Max needs to learn to open up, and she needs it desperately. So let's compare that to Eddie. On Eddie's side, what consequences do we get for him running away? Well, in the beginning, when he runs away from Chrissy dying, what's the consequence there? Is it just the fact that Chrissy dies? Personally, I don't see it. I don't think that her death is a very direct consequence of Eddie's actions. That would imply that Eddie could have changed something about how things turned out, which he definitely couldn't. He didn't have a clue what was going on, so he clearly couldn't have made much of a difference. But are there consequences later? Well, not really. When he hides from the police, there's no clear negative consequence for that. In fact, there's actually a positive consequence, and that's that he doesn't get immediately caught by the police. And of course, Jason finds him even when he is in hiding, but that's not a direct result of him hiding. If he had come out of hiding, they would have just found him sooner. And that's reiterated by all of the characters in the series again and again. They all tell him, no, you should be hiding, and Eddie seems to just be going along with that. So instead of instilling a sense of urgency or showing us that it's critical Eddie learn not to run away, this seems to imply the opposite, that he should be hiding because there are positive consequences for it. And because of that, we don't really get the sense that he actually needs to learn much. He seems to be doing pretty okay overall. There is one scene that I found that could be said to have consequences for Eddie's running away, and that is this introductory D&D scene. The players decide not to run away from Vecna, and because of that, they get a good consequence. They beat the campaign. But this isn't very effective for Eddie's arc, and there are several reasons for that. One is that it's not him doing the fighting or running away, it's the other players. Eddie's the dungeon master, so he's not actually playing the game. He's actually the creator of the campaign, so when he tells the players they should run away, it doesn't seem to be a flaw of his, it just seems to be DM advice, which in most cases is actually good advice because only the DM knows where the story is going. Two is that this isn't a negative consequence for running away, instead it's a positive consequence for standing your ground. In the beginning of an arc, you usually need to show why the character's flaw is a problem, and a positive consequence just doesn't really do that, mostly because it just means they didn't show their flaw, like they didn't do anything wrong, so we don't even know what the flaw is supposed to be. On top of that, it just doesn't hit as hard or make Eddie as sympathetic as a negative consequence would. If this scene had been Eddie as a player instead of the DM, and he had decided to run away and had lost the campaign because of that, then that would have worked a lot better for his arc. It might not have been the most impactful consequence or had much to do with the plot of the season at all, but it still would have fit the storytelling better. There's one other place where I think they could have introduced some more high-stakes consequences, and that's when Eddie jumps into Lover's Lake. Instead of having him follow after Robin, they could have had him actually stay behind, and this would have shown his cowardice in a lot clearer light, would have made it a lot more believable. And because he stayed behind on the lake where the police were patrolling, he could have gotten arrested, and that would have been a perfect negative consequence for avoiding danger. Of course, they would have to come up with some way to get him out of jail. Maybe his uncle could come and help break him out, and that would showcase their relationship a little bit more, because as it was, we only got a little of that. Or maybe instead of having this interrogation scene, Dustin and the rest could have banded together to get him out, and they could have figured out the communication with the Upside Down on the way somehow. The point is, the consequence would have made Eddie's problem a lot more real, just like Max's impending death. It might have pushed him more organically toward his arc, instead of having it feel out of the blue and unnecessary like flaws without consequences tend to feel. Speaking of Lover's Lake.
Which is why I would never have jumped in that lake to save your ass, not under any, normal circumstances.
Except you did. You literally did just jump in that lake to save him. He says it's because he was too ashamed to be the one left behind, but that doesn't change the fact that he's telling us something about his character here instead of showing it. And in fact, he's showing us the complete opposite of what he's telling us. I honestly find that just kind of hilarious. Like, it's so obvious. What were they thinking? Like, if you were really scared for your life, you wouldn't have jumped into certain death just because you were ashamed that the others were braver than you. That feels more like something Sirius Black would do. This has the spirit of someone who always takes a dare. His shame for not being as brave as his friends overruled his fear and cowardice, and so clearly his main problem isn't cowardice. This is an inconsistency between his words and his actions. And Eddie contradicts himself again when he fights the bats for the first time.
I see danger and I just turn heel and run.
These are not the actions of a person who runs from danger. In fact, they're the actions of a person who fully invites it, and maybe even a little too much. It's so obvious that it makes me wonder whether the writers actually did this on purpose. Like, if they wanted to make him seem like he just had a completely inaccurate read on himself, and that he used that wrong assumption about himself to justify running into a huge flock of bats and getting owned. Even though there was, like, honestly no real consequence to that either. Like, no positive consequence for the others. It's like he just hated himself for no valid reason. But to be serious though, if they had actually wanted Eddie's arc to be he had low self-esteem and thought he was a coward when he actually wasn't, then they would at least need to be consistent in their inconsistency. Like in the beginning, when Eddie talks about how he ran away from Chrissy, he actually did run away and he's being truthful about that. But then later he talks about how he's such a coward while doing all the things that a coward would never do. So we get a lot of mixed messages from Eddie, but in the end, it's going to be the ones he shows us rather than the ones he tells us that we're going to believe. According to his actions, Eddie is not a coward, and again, that means it doesn't feel like he needs to change, and it just renders his whole scene of change and his death unnecessary for his arc. So now let's talk about Max, and there's not much to say about this other than the fact that she's just actually consistent. All of her actions in the first 3 episodes, talking to Lucas, the meeting with the counselor, the letters, they all suggest the same thing, that she can't open up to people. And this bleeds through in every conversation she has. She's constantly putting up a wall and pushing others out, and she uses sarcasm and hostility to do this. It's incredibly consistent.
You're being sarcastic. You're being sarcastic? She's being sarcastic.
And she does mention that she can't open up once or twice. The therapist mentions it to her too. But for the most part, the things that Max says and the other characters around her are all much more subtle than Eddie's lines, and we'll get to that in a minute. The point is that what she says and what she does are consistent with each other. And it makes it way more believable that Max is really struggling and needs to change her behavior. And going back to Eddie for a second, there's one more time when Eddie's behavior and what we hear about him contradict each other, and I think this is worth mentioning. And that's when Dustin says that Eddie was like him and Mike's only friend when they started high school and the only person who took them under his wing. Up to this point, we haven't had that relationship shown to us at all. In fact, we've seen the complete opposite. If I had seen this scene only and had none of this context from Dustin about how they met, I would assume that Eddie was just the leader of another clique. Maybe the two of them had worked their way up to hanging out with him, and it feels like he could just kick them out of his group at any moment because they seem to be very scared of what he thinks of them, and there seems to be quite a bit of stakes attached to this conversation, maybe the stakes of their social life. If Eddie had been the one to extend friendship to them, to take them under his wing, I would expect them to feel a little more secure in that relationship, at least if it was anything like the close, tender friendship that Dustin seems to be describing in this line. As it stands, it just looks like the only reason they ended up hanging out was because the boys were desperate and not because the three of them really liked each other. And yes, Eddie does say a bit about how they met and how he was the only one who would accept them for who they were. But again, it's him telling us about just how good of friends they are and how much they need each other and not actually showing that to us. Instead, he's pushing them around. He's acting like a bit of a bully, and that's what he comes across as, a little bit of a bully.
There's a reason you hide from them.
Max, you know you can talk to me, right?
And I haven't told anyone this. I just can't.
So Max and the characters around her have so many lines that are nicely subtle and that force us to infer what's going on in her arc, and that's great for Show Don't Tell. There's a line of Max's that I particularly love because it perfectly exemplifies what I think showing and not telling with dialogue means, and that's this.
Just couldn't sleep. People kept blasting music in my ears for some reason.
This line seems simple enough at first, as most lines do, and on first watch you might dismiss it, but when you read into the connotation of this line, you really start to see some great things that this line is showing us in a subtle way. First off, it's a great fit for Max's character. It's keeping her consistent by playing into her sarcastic nature, but even beyond that, this line is a clever way of showing us what the other characters are going through in this moment, that they're dealing with a lot of stress and they're terrified of losing Max. They were blasting music in her ears all night long. They were depriving themselves of sleep for her because they know that if they don't, she could die. And there's a third layer. This line also serves to show us how Max feels about their protection because of Sadie Sink's great acting. She's smiling about it. She seems to be leaning into it. She's okay with this protection, and that's at the perfect moment in her arc where we know she's already learned to be more vulnerable at this point because we've already had her big moment of change, the confrontation with Vecna. This is just showcasing even more how the confrontation has changed her. Where before she was sarcastic about it and she didn't like them watching her all the time, she said their eyes were boring into the back of her head. Now she's realized how valuable their friendship is and that their protectiveness is a sign of that friendship, and she treasures that. She's willing to let them protect her and she's not going to push them away anymore. On the other hand, it seems like around every corner there's another on-the-nose Eddie line. Aside from the ones I've already mentioned, we've got this.
Outside of D&D, I am no hero.
And this.
I did the thing that I do now, apparently. I ran.
Can't forget that.
I ran away.
I just ran and I left her there.
And the worst offense of these lines is, I think, just the fact that a lot of them are telling us about events that should have been shown to us instead or have already been shown to us. Definitely the most egregious example is his last words.
I didn't run away this time, right?
No. You didn't run.
What gets me is the fact that they're literally explaining what just happened, like as if just to make sure we got it, even though it was already very clear what Eddie was trying to prove. And I also don't really like when he explains to Dustin and the crew about how he ran away from Chrissy. We never actually get to see that scene from Eddie's perspective, even though it's one of the most critical establishing scenes for his arc. We just see this small clip of him running outside the trailer from Max's perspective, and then we get him telling us about how he ran away. And even though he's telling us about an action he took, I don't think this is a particularly good use of dialogue, as in Max's case. I think this scene was much too important for his arc, and we really needed it shown to us instead of just having him tell us about it. And we also needed that clear negative consequence in order to root for him to change. And we got none of that. The only thing we get is this vague, regretful line delivery, which is all they had time for apparently. And on top of all of that, there just seems to be very little to read between the lines here. It's all very obvious, whereas with Max's line, we got the emotions of two different parties, both Max and the others who were protecting her. Here, we only get Eddie and his regret about leaving Chrissy behind. And even then, there was no real consequence, so it doesn't feel urgent in reality. And it doesn't quite land emotionally the way it would if we'd we'd actually seen him do it. But unfortunately, Chrissy's death scene is more focused on the mystery of the new monster rather than the character arcs actually happening within the story. The best part about that line from Max is that they don't overdo it. It's just the short reference and then we don't focus on it for too long or with too obvious lines. With Eddie's lines, they just retrace the same ruts over and over. It's like they really just couldn't find a synonym for the word run, and it comes across as unbelievable because of all the inconsistency, the lack of consequences, and lack of focus and screen time for his arc. We really needed more than a few self-deprecating lines to understand Eddie's arc, but for the most part, that's all we got, and it's a shame considering that Stranger Things has really twisted at my heartstrings in the past, and clearly they can do character arcs right. They just aren't expending enough effort on this one. Also because of the fact that Eddie really seems to have struck a chord with fans. He's become a bit of a fan favorite because he's relatable, he's an outcast, he's an underdog, he has a bit of a charming personality, and that does make him sympathetic. He's been in high school too long, and he's bitter towards a world that really doesn't understand him, and that's really validating and relatable to a lot of people. The problem is the writers seem to just have a lot of trouble trying to make his arc work, and maybe they needed to scrap this one entirely and just give him something entirely new, because as it stands, Eddie's arc didn't hit emotionally, at least for me anyway, and it just goes to show that you can have one of the most likable and relatable characters in your story and still end up with their character arc being a complete miss if you don't play your cards right. So the final moment of change for these character arcs gave me emotional reactions on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. In Max's big moment, I was holding back tears. Max's realization that she depends on her friends, her sudden desperation to get back to them in such a dire situation, as well as the fact that she's now given into vulnerability and she's ready to open up to her friends, is all conveyed very subtly and with very little dialogue. It hits just perfectly, and the music isn't bad either. With Eddie's, I'm almost ashamed to admit it, but I was holding back laughter, and I know that is not the reaction you would hope to have in a death scene, but unfortunately, it was the one that got across. I don't know, it was just also on the nose, and nothing was given enough focus for me to invest myself in it. Even this scene afterward with the uncle had me smirking a bit, because Dustin is just shamelessly telling us all these things we're clearly supposed to think about Eddie, and at this point, he's totally lost the game of charades. If this were Inception, I would reject that idea so fast. So Stranger Things is a very mixed bag of a show with some great emotional hits and a few legendary misses. But there is definitely a lot we can learn here about how to make our own character arcs hit, and I just want to summarize the key takeaways that I will be applying to my own writing. Number one is that negative consequences are super important to creating the space in your story for an arc. If you don't show how the character's flaws negatively affect their life, you feel no need for the character to change and you don't get proper setup, so your arc feels sudden and out of nowhere. And don't let other parts of your story take precedence over emotional character arcs, like the mystery of your new monster, for example, because character arcs are really the heart of your story. If those fall flat, there's little else that can save your story and make it great, at least in my opinion. Number two is that you can use dialogue to show how characters are feeling, but make sure you don't overdo it. Realize that the audience can pick up on the smallest cues, and you don't need to go stating what you want them to think all the time, and don't let it get repetitive or else it gets annoying. And number three, of course, is never let your character's actions contradict who they are. Know who your character is and what they're going to be feeling in any given moment. If you aren't constantly focused on your character's identity and how they personally will react to all different situations, then you're going to end up with them doing something that goes against who they are, and then when you try to prove it to the audience that they are a certain way, the audience isn't going to believe it because they've seen the opposite of that, and actions speak louder than words. So tell me, what did you guys learn from the recent season of Stranger Things, or do you guys have any theories for where the show will be going in the future? This season wasn't the best in its history, but it still had a few strong points, and I know it's still not going to keep me from watching the last season, if for nothing else than just to analyze it. Anyways, thanks so much for your attention, fellow students. Consider joining me for classes in the future. Never stop learning, and I'll see you around. Bye.